Welcome to the best of first-person episodes from Phantoms and Monsters. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of all future uploads.
Bizarre night at Skull Valley Primitive Campground, Utah. My experience at Skull Valley Primitive Campgrounds in Utah absolutely terrified me and has ruined camping for me, possibly for good. Here's what happened. The summer before last, I took a road trip from my home in Colorado up the west coast into Canada, my northernmost destination being Fernie, BC, Canada, as I have family there. I mapped out a series of free campgrounds to stay in instead of hotels. I loved camping, and it would help me stay on budget as well. My boyfriend at the time also was traveling, so we were planning to meet up in San Francisco and get to Seattle together. I was doing the first bit of the trip with just my dog, and my first planned campsite was a place called Skull Valley Primitive in Utah, owned by the Bureau of Land Management. I found the site easily. The camping spots are up a dirt hill, so I took the first site I saw, as my car is not made for off-roading. I set up my tent without any issues and changed into my hiking boots. It was so hot, I remember my poor dog had to have a cool towel down after I set up camp because he just couldn't get cooled off. There were a ton of other campsites, but hardly anyone using them. There were 2 RVs I came across parked super far away from my site, and I was definitely the only tent camper. I decided to go take a hike around before the sun was down. The campsite is adjacent to these mountains that rise out of flat ground and have what appear to be cave dwellings carved in the face of them. I wanted to investigate, so Teddy, my dog, and I started off in that direction. After only a few minutes of walking, we hit a barbed wire fence. I didn't think twice about ducking under it and continuing onwards. I just didn't think it would be a problem. Only a few yards after I had hopped the fence, I stopped dead in my tracks. An eerie and unusual sound was coming from the direction of the cave dwellings. The best description I can give you is that it sounded like dozens of humans trying to howl like wolves. Like many people pretending to be a wolf pack, and it sounded like its origin was inside the caves themselves. My dog was as spooked as I was, and had already started running back to the campsite when I turned around. The sounds continued until I was well inside the camp perimeters. The sun was almost completely set when I decided to let Teddy out for one last break. I was freaked out by what had happened and didn't want to be running around in the dark. Teddy is a dog that simply does not need a leash. He is never more than several feet away from me, so I didn't use one. I zipped up the tent and walked him away from our site, and then suddenly he was just gone. I couldn't see or hear any sign of him. The sun had finished setting by the time I finally gave up screaming for him and returned to my tent, which had not been left alone. The tent had a broken zipper when I arrived, and my stuff was strewn about inside, though nothing was missing. I want to emphasize the fact that during this time period I noticed there were no nature noises, no crickets chirping, or anything at all, and I felt what can only be described as complete dread, sheer terror. I was simply petrified. I've never felt so scared in my life. In fact, I feel the same terror just writing this out. It's truly the most scared I've ever been, and I will never forget it. I decided to grab my taser and keep trying to find Teddy. After a bit longer of whistling and shouting for him, I realized he was not coming back, so I headed into my tent. I used some safety pins. I had to pin it closed since the zipper was now broken. This is where things get even weirder. As I lay there trying not to totally freak out, something started to violently shake my tent from multiple angles. I could feel it, them brush against my feet sometimes, and the shaking was relentless. At some point, several hours later, I heard my dog outside the tent and peeked out. It was him. I quickly unpinned part of the flap, and he hopped in. His behavior was definitely off, and he reacted to the constant shaking of our tent even more so than I did. Neither of us slept that night, and as soon as morning came we were gone. I called my, now ex-boyfriend on the drive out, and recounted exactly what had happened. He started to Google the location and found out that the area I had walked into was actually the site of an extremely small and impoverished Native American reservation. His hypothesis was that they had been watching me and decided to mess with me after dark. I can believe this to some extent. It's somewhat plausible, I guess. Anyway, that's my story. It was the first and the last time I camped by myself during the trip, and sadly I have not returned to solo camping one since. TB.
Creepy camping incident in Cherokee National Forest, Tennessee. I have been holding this story in for a while and have tirelessly searched the internet to find another person who has experienced something similar, but to no avail. This story is entirely true, and although I loved the campground I stayed at and the beautiful nature that was all around, I'll have a tough time going back without finding out what the hell happened last time I went. My girlfriend had invited me on a camping trip to Indian Boundary Campground with her and her family a few months back. This campground is in the Cherokee National Forest near a city called Tellico Plains, Tennessee. The first few days of the trip went as expected. We hiked, made s'mores, and told scary stories. But little did I know that I would be in one soon. About halfway through the trip we decided to visit the local fish hatchery. Unfortunately, when we arrived the gates were closed and there were signs out saying that it was closed due to COVID-19. On the same bulletin board that these signs were on, there was an oddly out of place and very unsettling picture of a fish with its face cut straight open. Yes, the face was cut straight down the middle, so all that could be seen was the skeleton of the fish. There was text on the picture that read "Look," but it was in some strange font. Almost a creepypasta kind of font with characters like O. That itself wasn't all too weird. Just wrote it off as someone trying to play a prank and creep tourists out. Once we realized the hatchery was closed, we decided to change our plans for the day and head to a swimming hole that my girlfriend's grandma used as a child. We arrived to a beautiful, clear creek with a rope swing tied to a tree on the bank. An old lady sat in front of the tree smoking a cigarette with a rock in her lap. As my girlfriend and I approached the creek, we greeted the old woman, who seemed quite friendly, and that is when I noticed that she was using another smaller rock to etch something onto the larger rock that was in her lap. She eventually left the creek side, retreating to her camper, which was about 50 feet from the other side of the creek, and joined her husband. They both then sat outside their camper in lawn chairs facing the creek, and it seemed as though they just watched us from a distance for a good while. I didn't think too much of it. Sure, it was creepy, but they were just some harmless old people. Then I looked at the rock that the woman had been riding on. The word "look" was carved into it. I freaked out. Nothing else that was this strange happened throughout the rest of our trip, but this day still boggles my mind. I have no way of explaining these events, and still have not heard of anyone with similar experiences. But damn, the woods are creepy, and that is the last place I wanted to be scared to death. SB.
Sasquatch or Skookum spirit. My wife, daughter, and I went camping over the Labor Day holiday weekend. We both took off work Friday and headed off to meet up with a group of friends who were camping with their kids and dogs. They were already out there and had found a nice campsite that was big enough for our group. Just a spot off of a service road with primitive fire pit and not an official campground. In total there were 10 of us, 7 adults and 3 tweens. We were camping out in an area south of Mount Rainier, just outside of the park boundary, off of a road that would lead you to a locked gate that enters the park. We knew at the end of the road was a locked gate because all the cars that went that way only to flip back around because it was only accessible to national park staff. We set up our camp in a flat area that would fit our 2 tents that they had rigged up for us prior to us arriving. It was a bit closer to the road than their tents were. They had set up their tents much further back. Once camp was set up, we hung out with our friends while the kids played and had dinner around the fire. Just friends hanging out, having drinks, hanging around the fire, and all was great. We stayed up pretty late and everyone was getting tired and cold. Slowly everyone faded off to their tents and to bed. My wife was cold and went to warm up in the car and then proceeded to fall asleep in the car. Now my daughter and I are the last to awake out by the fire, and she decided that she wanted to sleep in the car where it was warm with my wife. I agreed that was okay after I attempted to wake my wife up and get her to come to the tent to go to sleep, and she was out cold. So I watched her go to her tent and grab her blanket and her sleeping bag for my wife as it was cold and I had turned the car off now. She grabbed the stuff and zipped up the tent and off to the car she went. I stayed up a little bit longer by the fire and must have dozed off momentarily because when I woke back up I was sitting in a camping chair by only glowing embers and it was pitch black. Only the coals of the fire glowing red, glowing in the now dead fire. I got up and found my way to the tent in the pitch blackness of the night and climbed in and went to sleep. I was exhausted and fell asleep as soon as I hid in that sleeping bag. Around 3:30 a.m. I woke up to my daughter's tent kind of rustling and what sounded like 2 female voices talking really softly. I listened intently trying to hear what they were saying, but I couldn't really understand anything. There were no real discernible words coming out, just mumbling. Then silence. I figured it was just my wife and daughter finding their way to my daughter's tent, not wanting to wake me up by being loud. Figured my wife was just going to sleep in the tent with my daughter. However, now I am up because my back is killing me because the air mattress is now flat and airless. As I lay there in what I can only describe as dead silence, I hear cracking like sticks breaking or popping, so I assume that the fire is still hanging on somehow. Then I hear something moving around towards the front of my tent and it stops. Something is directly outside the front of my tent. I can feel it and sense it. So I slowly raise up to a seated position and hear something breathe in and exhale a large breath. This is the heaviest breath I have ever heard, and it was followed by what I can only describe as a very loud huff, as if from a horse or cow or some very large animal. I sat there frozen with fear, trying to rationalize what it is I am hearing, and it stopped. All I heard was the one deep inhale and exhale, and that huff sound, then everything went silent. What followed next is an owl hooting a little ways off back from behind the area of our friends' tents, and after that I heard nothing else. No sounds at all, no fire popping, sticks cracking, nothing. I stayed there sitting up frozen with fear for what seemed like forever, until I could tell the sun was coming up and that it was light out now. I muster up the courage and go outside and check the ground in front of my tent, and that's when I notice my daughter's tent unzipped and empty. I panic and rush to the car, and there they are in the car, sound asleep. I see not a single track, nothing around our tents, and everyone else is about 20 to 30 yards away in their tents. Now I am freaking the hell out. Who did I hear talking? Who was skulking around the tent? What the hell was that breathing in front of me and huffing outside my tent? What opened my daughter's tent zipper? Surely there is an explanation, and I sit out there for at least an hour getting the fire going, as our friends begin to get up and move about. They slowly make their way to the fire, and I immediately start asking them, where were the dogs all night? Did you let them out? Were they sniffing around my tent? Did any of you wake up and were talking or moving around, and did you hear that owl? Nope, no, and no, they all replied. I have no idea what that was talking softly and what was breathing and huffing right in front of me. What the hell opened my daughter's tent in the night? I watched her zip it shut and go to the car. That breathe and huff was so scary it left me frozen with fear, and I didn't move at all after hearing it, and sat there as silent as possible, not even wanting to breathe. One of the scariest moments of my life, something large and unknown in the darkness directly in front of me, and only thing separating us is a thin tent wall. This all happened Friday into Saturday morning, and we still have another night here. I decided that I am not sleeping in the tents, and neither are my wife and daughter tonight or ever again. The rest of the day goes great, hanging out, having breakfast, went into town, Ashford, and went for a hike down the road to Core Lake. Basically just camping and hanging. It's getting later now, and although the sun is out and blue skies, the canopy in our camping area is thick, and even at the brightest point in the day was still pretty dark compared to road area. As we are hanging out, we hear woo-woo-ops way off in the distance, and we are thinking, what is that? More time passes by, and now a few of the people that were there when we arrived at camp have left. Just 7 of us left, and 2 of the 7 were pretty much always in their tent. So that left 5 of us out hanging out by the fire. That's when dusk crept in and my buddy began working on dinner for all of us. As we sat there, from off in the woods between us and the park boundary towards the creek, we hear these blood-curdling screams and wood-type howls that everyone heard. We all stopped talking and fell silent, and we all began to ask each other, WTF was that? We heard this about 4 or 5 times. It sounded like a woman being murdered and howl type of sound. Then came a few tree knocks from the same general direction. Is someone messing with us out here? Everyone was thinking. Keep in mind it is a holiday weekend, so tons of campers within a 15-mile radius. So I call my buddy over, and he hadn't heard the screams because he had been cooking on a skillet and had a propane lantern in front of him and behind him, and they are loud. We stand there and listen and don't hear it. We decide we will do a tree knock back, closer to the road that divided us from the area we heard these vocalizations and knocks from. That is when we heard it. I got a chill down my spine to my core and the hairs raised up on my arms and neck. We both looked at one another and at the same time asked, "Did you freaking hear that?" I asked him what he heard, and we had both heard what we can only describe as a monkey or gorilla sound, like you would hear on Discovery Channel or something. It was like a ooh ah 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 sound. It was far off but deep and rumbling, sounding unlike what you hear on TV. I won't say it was like directed or focused at us. I only say that because the other people were sitting behind us, maybe only 10 feet away, and they didn't hear it, only us. Now we are freaking the hell out and nobody is sleeping in their tents. We don't want to say anything and freak everyone else because at this point they are already on edge. I have been hiking and camping here in the PNW for almost 20 years now. I have never experienced this while I was camping out with family and friends. I am 39 years old from the East Coast and have been shot at and chased at growing up in the ghetto. I am a former US Army infantryman who has spent countless nights in only a sleeping bag in a dugout sleeping hole and in tents. I am now afraid to ever sleep in a tent again after this weekend. I have never really ever felt fear like I did that first night in all my time in the forests out here, except when I was a kid in the woods back home. JB.
Was it the Ozark Howler? I don't have any idea what I witnessed Saturday evening, but it was the most frightening experience of my life. My wife and I were camping at an RV park near Jasper, Arkansas, and planned to be there for several days. We arrived early Saturday and got situated soon after. My wife wanted to look around the area since she had never been in the Ozarks. I was born and raised in the mountains and was familiar with the terrain and wildlife. After we tinkered around the campsite, we decided to take a short hike through a nearby valley. There were a few caves and caverns along the way, but nothing where I would have guessed any large predator would be living. After walking for an hour, we started to head back towards the RV park. Not long after we started walking back down the trail, something caught my eye on the right in a sassafras thicket. My wife sensed it as well and stopped to look in the same direction. I could see this dark four-legged creature moving back and forth slowly through the brush. We immediately started to walk at a fast pace back towards the park. This creature was moving along as well, keeping its distance, but tracking us. This continued for what seemed like 10 minutes until we reached the clearing. We got back to the campsite very shaken and nervous. All my years growing up in these mountains, and I had never seen anything comparable to it. From what I could gather, it was very large, almost the size of a black bear, but moved close to the ground like a cat. It was also very dark in color. We didn't say anything to others camping nearby. The rest of the evening was very quiet and peaceful until around 2:15 a.m. we heard what sounded like a high-pitched howl coming from a distance. It was loud enough to wake both of us, and I noticed several campers were looking outside, milling around and talking as well. Someone said it was just a coyote, but that was not a coyote or anything else I had ever heard before. The next morning we woke around 9 a.m. When I stepped out of the RV, a woman walked up to me and asked if I had heard the howling. I said that I did and had no idea what it was. The woman, who was camping nearby, said that she believed it to be the Ozark Howler and that there had been a few sightings recently. I knew the stories about the Ozark Howler, but never believed any of it. Well, my wife wanted to leave ASAP. Now I'm not sure what to think. We came home today and I looked up the Ozark Howler. There isn't much to go on. I read your blog and thought you may want to get the word out. Is it possible this creature may live?
This is Lon Strickler. If you like this program, it would help us if you would give it a thumbs up. Then subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notification when we upload new first-person encounters. We have many more to come very soon. And by the way, if you have a suggestion or an experience of your own, please leave a comment.